As protests, sanctions, and U.S. warships squeeze Tehran, Beijing has quietly become Iran's most important lifeline, economically, politically, and now potentially militarily.
As pressure mounts on Tehran, Beijing is stepping forward with a clear signal of support.
It's been described as a strategic deal. China and Iran have signed a long-term agreement worth billions of dollars.
China's most important strategic advantage is not its military, its technology, or even its economy. It is a country, Iran. Over the past decade, Beijing has quietly turned one of the world's most sanctioned states into a key pillar of its global strategy. This partnership rarely makes headlines, but it plays a central role in how China secures energy, weakens Western sanctions, and prepares for long-term competition with the United States. To understand why Iran matters so much to China, we first need to understand China's biggest vulnerability. China produces only a fraction of the oil it consumes. More than 80% of its oil is imported, and nearly 70% of those imports pass through the Strait of Malacca, a narrow maritime choke point between Malaysia and Indonesia. If this route were disrupted, even briefly, China's economy would face serious consequences within weeks. This is why Beijing worries less about winning wars and more about surviving pressure. Sanctions, financial controls, and dominance over global shipping lanes are the West's most powerful tools against rising powers. Those tools have already been used extensively against one country. Iran is the most sanctioned nation in modern history. It has been cut off from the dollar, excluded from global banking, and restricted from international trade. By conventional logic, this level of pressure should have collapsed its economy. Instead, Iran adapted, and in doing so, it became strategically valuable to China. While Washington focused on isolating Tehran, Beijing saw something different. A country with vast energy reserves, very few buyers, and a willingness to operate outside Western-controlled systems. Iran was not just another oil supplier. It was a solution to one of China's most serious strategic problems. China's relationship with Iran is often described as ideological, but in reality, it is transactional. At its core, Iran solves two problems China cares about most: energy security and sanctions resilience. China is the world's largest oil importer, but it has limited control over how that oil reaches its shores. Saudi Arabia supplies roughly 17% of China's oil, making it its largest supplier. But Saudi Arabia is also a long-standing American security partner. In a major geopolitical crisis, Beijing cannot assume Riyadh would prioritize Chinese interests over U.S. pressure. Iran is different. Iran supplies a smaller share of China's oil, roughly 10 to 11% in recent years, but under very different terms, because Iran is heavily sanctioned and has few buyers. China secures Iranian oil at discounts estimated between 20 and 30% below market prices. Over time, this saves Beijing tens of billions of dollars. More importantly, Iran is willing to make commitments others will not. Tehran has agreed to prioritize oil deliveries to China, even during regional conflicts or global crises. In strategic terms, this turns Iranian oil into insurance, not just cheaper energy, but guaranteed energy when it matters most. This logic explains the 25-year China-Iran cooperation agreement, often valued at around $400 billion. Most of that investment is tied to long-term energy purchases, while the rest funds infrastructure that locks Iran more tightly into China's economic orbit. Energy, however, is only part of the story. The deeper value of Iran lies in what it has learned from decades of sanctions. Iran has been cut off from the dollar system, excluded from SWIFT, and locked out of Western banking. To survive, it developed alternative ways to trade, settle payments, and move goods across borders. China did not just observe this process, it studied it. A large share of China-Iran trade is settled directly in yuan. Oil is sold without touching the dollar. Payments move through Chinese state banks that are largely insulated from Western pressure. In many cases, trade bypasses money entirely, relying on barter arrangements where oil is exchanged for infrastructure, machinery, or technology. These transactions are supported by layers of intermediaries. Companies registered in third countries handle logistics and payments. Shipments are rerouted, blended, or obscured in ways that make enforcement difficult. The system is complex, but it works. Iran has also experimented with cryptocurrency and digital settlement mechanisms to monetize sanctioned oil sales. While limited in scale, these efforts give China valuable insight into how non-Western financial systems function under pressure. This is what makes Iran uniquely important. Iran is not just a supplier, it is a testing ground, a real-world laboratory where China experiments with surviving sanctions, bypassing the dollar and maintaining trade under maximum pressure. What works in Iran can be replicated elsewhere. And in Beijing's long-term planning, these systems are not only for partners, they are preparation. If China ever faces comprehensive Western sanctions, many of the tools it would rely on have already been tested inside Iran. That is what turns Iran into something more than a trading partner. It turns Iran into a strategic asset. This partnership, however, is not without serious risks. The most sensitive issue is Iran's nuclear program. China's public position remains deliberately vague. It calls for dialogue, urges restraint, and avoids taking sides. This silence is intentional. Beijing does not want to endorse Iran's nuclear ambitions, but it also does not want to pressure Tehran in ways that could weaken the partnership. From China's perspective, the ideal outcome is not a nuclear-armed Iran, but a nuclear-capable one, permanently close to the threshold without crossing it. This gray zone status serves multiple Chinese interests. It keeps Western governments focused on the Middle East, ties up diplomatic and military resources, and increases Iran's dependence on China. At the same time, China retains plausible deniability if tensions escalate. But this strategy has limits. If Iran crosses the nuclear threshold or triggers a large-scale conflict with Israel or the United States, Chinese investments inside Iran could be damaged or destroyed overnight. Ports, railways, and energy infrastructure are all highly vulnerable in wartime. There is also the risk of secondary sanctions. As China-Iran cooperation deepens, Western pressure may increasingly target Chinese banks, shipping firms, and technology companies. That would force Beijing into difficult choices between access to Western markets and its Iranian strategy. Iran gives China leverage, but it also creates exposure. There is another consequence that receives far less attention. India has long viewed Iran as a strategic gateway to Central Asia and Afghanistan, particularly through projects like Chabahar Port. As China's footprint inside Iran expands, that space narrows. For New Delhi, this creates a dilemma. India is increasingly aligned with the United States in the Indo-Pacific, yet it cannot afford to lose access to Iran entirely. That forces India into a careful balancing act, engaging Tehran quietly while avoiding direct confrontation with Beijing. In this way, Iran does not only complicate China-West relations, it reshapes strategic calculations across Asia. Looking ahead, there are three broad futures for the China-Iran relationship. First, sanctions continue to lose effectiveness. The China-Iran model expands. More sanctioned states integrate into alternative trade and payment systems, and a parallel global economy grows alongside the dollar-based system. Western leverage steadily declines. In the second, the system settles into a prolonged stalemate. China and Iran deepen cooperation quietly, while the West responds with additional sanctions that deliver diminishing returns. Energy markets remain volatile, regional conflicts persist, and the global economy slowly fragments into competing blocs. In the third, diplomacy produces a partial reset. A new agreement reduces tensions with Iran and eases some sanctions. But even in this scenario, the architecture remains. China and Iran have already demonstrated that survival outside Western systems is possible, and that knowledge cannot be undone. Across all three outcomes, one conclusion is clear. The attempt to isolate Iran did not remove it from the global system. Instead, it integrated Iran into China's long-term strategy in ways that weakened the very tools isolation relied on. Iran is not China's ally in the traditional sense. It is not a proxy, and it is not a friend. It is something more useful than either, a strategic asset shaped by pressure, necessity, and shared experience. And as long as China needs energy security and protection from economic warfare, this partnership is unlikely to disappear. The real question is no longer whether the China-Iran relationship will survive, but how deeply it will reshape the global balance of power as it grows.